Hello everybody, let's go through some renders. So first we've got Cram Burglar. This took longer than it needed to. Feedback welcome. Alright, let's open it up. So the first thing I'd say is I actually really like this render. I like the use of depth of field, I like the textures that you've used on the Pokeball. I like the textures that you've used on the pillow, as well as the slight adjustments and variations in where the weight has been put. I also really like actually how you've modeled it. It's quite in proportion and nice and everything there too. The main thing that is getting me is the choice of color for the pillow. I feel like you could have gone for a warmer color and that would give it just a little bit more of a nicer contrast with the background, and that will give a nicer balance to the image as a whole. I also think that you could look into different camera angles. I do like the composition that you've got here, but maybe just look into different variations of maybe a tighter look at the Pokeball, maybe one that's a bit more front on, a lower or higher one, changing the field of view as well. Just making some adjustments like that could really really tighten up the render, make it a bit more full. Possibly too looking into adding a HDRI to capture just a few extra lighting and reflections. Even though this isn't really much of a reflective piece, it could just add a little bit more depth and detail to the piece, as well as possibly looking into adding bloom, just so that there can be a little bit more with some of these lighter areas, just to catch a little bit more light shining off of it. But overall, great image, nice work. And now we've got Zay Street. I don't know what it is. I improvised this thing in 20 minutes. Any suggestion to change, improve it? Okay, so the first thing I'm actually going to do is copy it over into GIMP and just making some, so this is the original, just making some adjustments to the contrast, or sorry, the brightness, just so we can see the actual moon and the details on this sort of plinth a little bit better. I also think that we can crop it a little bit closer to the actual moon, just because that can then be the focus. But we can also give it a little bit more room if we really wanted to show the plinth off a little bit more. I just feel like there's a lot of area that you can crop out and it will still keep the image there. The other thing I would be saying is putting an image or a model behind the model you've got here instead of the HDRI. It's really good that you're using a HDRI, but they tend to have quite low resolution and it can really take away from the detailed piece that you've got here. I would also look into adding a slight bit of bloom so that there can be a bit more shine to some of these lighter bits, especially the light blue section here. I would also consider adding a slight bevel to the edge of this, just so it can catch the light a little bit better around on this edge here. I like the texture that you've used here with the smudges and everything too. I would say that generally, yeah, your lighting is pretty good, and maybe even possibly adding a second light coming down here if you haven't already, just to maybe fill it up a little bit more, but it would just only be a subtle light. Possibly adding in some more details too to this plinth here. But yeah, I would say that you've done a really good job in that short amount of time, and it's just looking into those basic things like composition and some lighting rendering effects, as well as the background that can really add this into something else. Even as well looking into something into the foreground and background to give it a bit more depth in this. But no, nice work. Okay, now we've got Xeno's music. What do you think it's missing? I really need some advice. Okay, so I've chosen two of the images which are basically the same. I would assume that this is probably the strongest one. Excuse me. This would be the strongest one because of the texturing. And so what I'm going to do is just copy the image and put it into GIMP. I feel like there can just be some slight adjustments with composition. So sometimes it's not what it's missing, but because you have all this extra area, that can make it feel like it's empty. So sometimes with a tighter crop, you can make the image feel more full. And I also think through adjusting the lighting slightly, you can give a better sense of balance through the image. As well as what I'm going to do is add just a little bit more color to it by putting on just an overlay of yellow, and then I'm going to make some minor adjustments to the shade. I would then also probably just add a little bit more texture to the ground here, adding a little bit more of a bevel to these harsh edges that you've got on the models, just so it captures the light in a bit of more of an interesting way. And the reason I made it yellow is I feel like you should add colored lights instead of just the pure white lights, because they will give a bit more depth to the scene. So even if I just scroll through having a like more blue light, and we can make it a bit less saturated, then it can just give a whole different feel to the scene. And I feel like through that, as well as adding some post-rendering effects like bloom and using a HDRI map to add a little bit more detail to the reflections, then I think that this could really complete the piece without having to actually add too much more. Maybe even spreading out some of these 3D shapes around the scene, like the little spheres and stuff, just a little bit more, and it could make the scene a little bit more complete. Also considering adding a vignette around the edge of the render, which could tighten the shot up a little bit more, focusing on this major part here. Hopefully that gives you some things to explore, and hopefully it can get you to make sure it feels like it's finished and complete. And now we've got my crow sign, animating my chair, bouncing and expanding, fades off, seems so stiff. Any tips to improve that? Alright, let's open it up. Okay, very nice work. So we've got some really nice transitions in here. Yeah, so even if we just look at this first animation, boom, you could add some slight wiggles, like some boom, boom, like a second little section there. They can just give a bit more of an emphasis on the actual movement and then pausing and stuff of it. And it's a lot about the timing of making things just whip a little bit quicker right at the end there, but you had a really nice transition as it comes around. And I do like the little swings that you've got. I think it's just thinking about the inertia of the actual models moving, and so as if they were to connect onto pieces, there'd be a slight wiggle and then realignment at the end. And I think just looking into maybe even using, I'm not sure if you can do it, but using a noise sort of filter style thing on the bounce up and down, so it's got just a little bit of variation and imperfection to it, which can just make it look a little bit more natural, because it's a lot about those little imperfections that you've got in there too. In terms of rendering this too, I would just say to possibly add a secondary light source just to come from a slightly different angle that might just give a little bit more fill to the actual model and give a bit more of a 3D look to it. I also feel like you're using a HDRI possibly. It's hard to tell. If I come back to this one, Maybe you're not. So I would look into using a HDRI just to add a little bit more detail to the reflections. And I would possibly even consider adding a trim or something just to smooth off this angle. The other main thing that's really getting me is this major shadow on the side here. So I'd be considering your composition of the camera, maybe making it a bit more front on so we see this wall a bit more front on, or just adjusting where this shadow is coming from just so it's not as predominant. Possibly even making the shadows a bit softer by using an area light. And also considering the use of bloom to get a bit of shine on where the lightest bits of your model are coming, just to have it a bit more natural looking. But so far that's really nice. Hopefully those sort of things give you a good direction to look into. Now I've got Luke PSD Dents, and he's made, or she has made, some teeth. Now I'm just going to focus on this one model because I would assume that the other model, the gold one there, is the exact same. And so you've done a tighter crop here, which is really nice. I do really like the way this was cropped, and I feel like you did it quite well. But we'll just look at this image just because it's a more complete model. And it looks like either you've done this in Blender or in editing software of adding the sparkles. I do like the sparkles. I feel like they add a lot to the image, especially the style of image. Some things I'd maybe look into is considering using a HDRI if you haven't already, just to capture some interesting reflections with the piece, as well as looking into your use of materials, maybe just looking into some different variations as well as colors, just to see which ones work best. At the moment I do like the blue and this color here, but there could just be some slight variations. Even if I just go into GIMP and do some variations in here, where it could be quite subtle in terms of the difference, but these sort of things can make a difference. I also think that using a slightly more predominant texture map on this, because I feel like you do have one. If I look at the other image that you've got here, maybe you do, maybe you don't, but just looking into adding in some little imperfections like smudges, or having a normal map just for some extra bumps, as well as looking into your lighting resolution just so it maybe makes a bit of a smoother image, but also consider using a higher resolution render too, just for when you're uploading it can be a nice sharper image. And possibly adding a little bit more color to the sparkles too, or brightness, just because I feel like they're going a bit grey in some of the darker areas. But yeah, I think also you can start to consider the background too a little bit more, maybe even adding a bit more color or gradient, or even just a very dark blue, and considering a vignette to maybe bring our eyes a little bit closer to the teeth. But so far that's a really nice render that you've got there. Hopefully those things that I said can add a little bit more into what you want to do. Now I've got Substantial Can 7480. After following the tutorial on how to make an isometric kitchen, I feel there's still something missing with this rendering. Nice amount of upvotes you got there, voila! Alright, let's have a look in. So I know that it's low poly, but you could also just consider adding a bevel around these harsher edges just to smooth them out, kind of like how you did with the tabletop, but just a little bit less intense, just so we can get a nicer line going across there. Now I would also consider the use of a HDRI just to add a little bit to your lighting and your reflections. you might not feel like you need to, but just maybe explore it just to see what it can add to it. I feel like I don't think you've used bloom, so maybe consider adding a little bit of bloom to heighten up some of the brightest bits of this model, of this render, sorry. And I like the little imperfections like the dust that you've added onto this sort of whiteboard area and the stickers. I would add possibly just some minor mess like a pen or a magazine possibly to the table. And I do really like this render. I feel like you should be really happy with it. But I do think, yeah, just adding some little bevels and stuff around some areas, maybe just adjusting this sink a little bit more so it has a bit more of a smoother shape, maybe even looking into the material as well that you've used for this to add a little bit more texture to it, just like how you have with the tabletop, and like adding even just the little smudges and stuff in, like the watermarks. A nice little cactus that you've got in there, and the pot. And in terms of the crop of the model as well, you've done quite a nice job. I do like the colors and stuff that you've used. Hopefully those little things do just give you some things to explore. Oh, and possibly looking into depth of field just a little bit, just so that, say, these further areas can have a little bit of blur, but that might be too so minor that it's not needed. Just something to explore into. Hopefully that helps. Now we've got awkward ads 7379. What should I improve? I'm going to text you this thing, so please give me some feedback so then I can add some more detail. Let's open it up. Okay, so first thing I would do is looking into adding a bevel to these harsher edges here, just so they can capture the light a little bit more. I would add some variations, a little bit more variations in the size of these books, so in terms of thickness and height, as well as adding in some other objects in, say, like where these two books are, just removing them, or you might choose other areas, removing them and adding different shapes, like different little pot plants or different objects like teddy bears and stuff. I feel like the books also are going very much in the same direction and they look like they've been copied. So adding a bit more variation to their angles, the way that they've been put together, can make it look a bit more natural. Possibly also consider adding something on the top of this bookcase. And I do like the curtains. I feel like you can add a little bit more into this window, possibly putting stuff on the top here of just even like a toy or a pencil tin or something like that, like a little lamp. Think too as well about probably, I would say this is stairs into a door, so probably add a door in there. Add in also little cables for where this lamp would be connected into the wall, as well as for the TV, even though you might not see it. I also think adding a few little things onto this table could really add to it. Consider the proportions as well of the mug that you're using. This is quite a flat mug, so maybe just give it a little bit more. I do like the lounges that you've been putting together, but maybe adding a bit more of a sink, and as if someone had been sitting in there, maybe making it recline just a little bit more so it's a bit more on an angle, as if someone was to sit into it a little bit more. And adding in a rug onto the ground can really add some nice depth and connection to the scene. I think the proportions is definitely something for you to look into too. Like the size of one of these books compared to the lounge would mean that either these people are really small or these lounges are really small. Like just the book is the same length as a person's whole forearm. So it's just something to look into with that, just looking into proportion. And it could be that you maybe bring in a model of a person and then measure everything up like that, or get more exact measurements of things online, like and work in more mechanically by a meter standard or something, so that the doors are the right height for a person, and then the table is about the same length as a table that you've got at home, stuff like that, just so that things are generally a bit more in proportion. Yeah, hopefully that helps. I really like the composition that you've put together too, like the cropping. But yeah, hopefully that gives you some things to look into for the future. Now we've got the CatRel. I'm looking for some critiques. What can I improve and which objects could I add? So first thing I'm actually going to do is bring it into GIMP, just to heighten up the contrast, and the brightness just a little bit, so I can see it a bit better. One thing I would add is, see with this light here, you can add a little bit of bloom to it. It'll make it shine a little bit more, which will be nice, but also adding a bit of color to that light. So the way I'm going to try and do that, like in a sort of fake way, is just put an overlay over the shot and color it slightly like this. Now when you do your lighting, it'll work a bit differently, but this gives you a bit more of an indication about how it could look. Having that lighting in there will add a little bit more warmth to the scene, but if you wanted it to be a bit colder, you can make it a sort of bluey color. And now I would look into using a HDRI, if you haven't already, just to capture some more interesting reflections on things that are reflective, and it can add a little bit of extra lighting color to your scene too. I would also look into how you've composed the image. I would probably just bring the camera back a little bit more, just so we can see maybe a little bit more of this ladder and a little bit more of this cable here. Think about where your actual focus is. I would say you're probably focusing possibly on this light here a little bit and into the distance. So try and make it a bit more complete of seeing those areas. And so also considering contextually where these cables are connected to and why they're just connected to the wall, not just for the aesthetic purpose of it. So you might even just want to add a little block or something in there to make it look like it has a bit more reason to connect into that wall. I like the textures as well that you've got on the walls and everything too, and I like the rain that you've got. Consider possibly adding in a bit of motion blur to blur those raindrops a little bit more. Maybe adding in some raindrop effects onto the water here, just so it can look like the water and the rain are connecting to each other here. Consider also depth of field for things in the distance, and I would try and emphasize the stuff in the foreground just a little bit more, as this is in the foreground but it had been cut off, so I'd probably want to see the edge where this connects in the image render, just so I can have a bit more context about how long this is. And now you might actually have it connected in there, but the shadow is so predominant that it feels like it's being extended out. So I would also consider adding a secondary light, possibly behind the camera, maybe from a high point, and pointing down and giving that a certain color too. Now I'd be just choosing a color that isn't the color you've chosen for this light. So it could be a red or a green or a yellow or whatever other color, just so then it now can give a bit more shape to these things in the foreground. And I guess that's all I'm going to say about that. Hopefully that gives you a whole load of things to look into and explore, just to help refine this render. And now we've got ORS 3. I modeled this from a tutorial, but the materials were all done by me. Anything I can do to improve. Alright, so what did you say? model this from a tutorial. Okay, yeah. Alright, so the first thing I would actually do is add in a HDRI into your image just to capture a bit more interesting reflections around this model, but also add in a background so that we can't see the HDRI. It could just be a black plane, or you could just render a black color. And I would look into how the polygons are placed, especially around this section, because I feel like there's lumps that you didn't really intend to have in this section. I do like your use of bevel around these sections here, and I think you can also consider using them a bit more. Sorry. I feel like you can consider adding them more consistently around your models, as well as using smoothing on these sections here so I can have a bit more of a consistent curve like you do in some other sections. I do like the color choices that you've put in with this. Maybe you could add just some slight variations with a lighter orange and a darker orange in some areas, just to give it a bit more variation. I would look into adding depth of field just to give this a bit more of a sense of scale, and as well, because I don't really know what type of model this is, like what it is, it could look like it's maybe some sort of spaceshipy style cyber thing. Maybe giving it a bit more context by putting it into a scene, even just putting it onto a table or a bit of concrete or something like that. It can give a better sense of scale and a bit more reasoning about what it actually is. I would also look into your camera angles too, as this is quite pointed directly at the model. I would probably put the camera up a little bit higher so you can get a bit more of the details on the top of this model. And I would also consider using 2 light sources rather than this one, and coloring the lights. So having one light coming down from this angle, probably maybe a yellow light, and then a secondary light coming from the bottom coming up, which will fill in all the areas that this first light didn't get, and use either a complementary color or just another color. So say if this one's yellow, it could be a blue, or it could be maybe even a green or a red, just to give it a bit more variation. And you'll notice that it'll probably give a lot more roundness to the model, as in making it look like it pops out a whole lot more, and gives it a bit more interesting color looks and variation along the model. I'd also look into then bloom too, just to make it a bit more bright in some of these areas here where it'll like shine out the light a little bit more. And yeah, hopefully that helps. I feel like I've said everything I could say about this model so far. Hopefully that gives you some direction in what you can do next. Now we've got X now, so I don't know if the scene is too dark or not, which might have made it lose some of the depth. I'd like any type of feedback. Alright, well let's brighten it up slightly and just have a bit of a look. Okay, so that's really bright, just to try and see what detail that you've got there. Now if that's what it was before, I'd probably be brightening it up maybe about this much. Okay, so I would up the resolution of your lighting just a little bit more so it's not as grainy. And I don't think this is a HDRI because I feel like this was probably placed in here. Do consider using a HDRI just to add in some more interesting reflections to the scene. And I think also consider adding bloom too, to add a bit more shine to these lighter areas. Your composition is quite nice. I do like it. I'd probably add just a secondary light or 2 down the bottom here, just to brighten up these areas, even in a really subtle way. Maybe even just using like a dark blue, just to give it a bit more depth and a bit more detail down here. And I feel like you could give a little bit more room up the top here in terms of composition, so just having a little bit more area to breathe on the top. But I think that the amount on the bottom is really nice. I like your use of depth of field too. And your color choices are really nice too. You could possibly even add in some floating dust into the air, which could add a little bit more depth to it. But yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say about this piece so far. There's a lot of really good things about it, and I think you can just add a little bit more to it to extend it. Hopefully that helps. Now we've got Mr. XPX, Hazard Suit 2, work in progress. So I've chosen 2 of the images that you've uploaded just because I feel like they showed the model the best. And now we've got a nice amount of bloom for this type of model. I would say to consider adding a HDRI into the scene just to add a bit more interesting reflections to some of this model. Now it looks like you are going for a low poly style look. So I'm just going to say, but you don't need to add it into there. Adding a bit more of a bevel to some of these smaller, harsher lines in here too. I can see that you've added up some sort of bevels around here, but just even still consider them on the smaller areas. It'll help catch the light a little bit more. You might have one here, but it's just not noticeable. So it's just something to remember to do for certain areas. I would consider adding depth of field too to your renders too, just to blur out this background a little bit more. Consider also still adding in a light, even though this is using just bloom to light it up. Still put in a light or two. I would recommend maybe a light up the top here that would be a slight yellow, and then maybe a slight blue or green or red from the bottom here, just to light it up a little bit more. Especially if you're presenting this character, just so we can see the details a little bit more. And now I'd probably add some extra details into this bicep here, like little bolts or little streams along the bicep. And I'm sure that it's an artistic choice to not put in the shoulder joint here, probably to help with animating as well. But just to point that out, that you are missing that. It could be interesting to put in just a big ball or something in there. And then also looking into proportions of hands compared to the forearm and the bicep. So I would probably just put in a character model to be a placeholder for the person in this suit, and then build the suit around them so that you can have all the proper sizing and everything too. And I would also consider about how this person, their spine will move slightly, possibly in this suit. So consider about how you would need to have this midsection area bend and twist. And it looks like, yep, you've added in a light in this scene. Remember to add just a little bit of color to your lighting too. It can really add a bit more warmth or depth or emotion to your scene. And I do like this model that you've got here. I feel like, again, just considering a slight bevel in some areas. For the background too, adding just a little bit more color to it can make this stand out. So because this is an orange, maybe using like a dark blue to help it pop out a whole lot more. Hopefully that gives you some stuff to consider for your models, and gives you some direction with things to explore. Cheers. Right now we've got Mars Divided, work in progress of my first project, a sword I made from scratch. Sweet. Okay, so let's have just a look at the big model. It seems like proportion, from at least my knowledge, seems quite well. I would be also looking into using a reference just for proportion of the sword, and it doesn't need to mean that you need to use their designs, but just the proportions of where the handle marks are, the length of the sword in relation to the handles, stuff like that. Now if we have a look into here, you can definitely add some more details into these sections, probably even add in some extra resolution into the model so that it can have a smoother curve and everything too. And I would probably add in some tiny little bolts or marks here. Like, I think that you're not up to the texturing phase yet, but definitely throw in some nice metallic materials and then some nice like leathery looking materials for the handle. Definitely learn how to render too, rather than doing the screen cap, just because you can then muck around with lighting and still practice the basics of composition and lighting and rendering. But it's still probably early days for you, so I won't be too harsh on that, but I think it's definitely something to learn. And look about how the polygons are placed, just so we can have a nice smoother line here. It could be that you just need to angle it a little bit more, or cut this probably one polygon into a few different pieces, just so I can bend the light just in a bit of a nicer way. But so far it's a really good piece. And also consider these little areas here. It's probably this messing up of polygons not being connected or overlapping and stuff like that. Look into how you might be overlapping polygons here unintentionally too. But this is probably one of your first early models, so it's all, like, I'm say early, but it's probably a new way of making these sort of things. So just be patient with yourself, just trying to look out for the flaws and stuff as you're building it, just like these little areas and stuff, but you'll find your process soon enough, and it's really nice. I think you should be proud with it. Hopefully those little tips give you some direction with your future pieces. Now we've got Ice Sculpt Waifus. I modeled a kitchen, added a character for reference. So we've got the one with the character and the one with the model. Now the first thing I would say is looking into your proportions and having something consistent from the beginning. As when I look at this piece without the model, then you make the seats nice and small. So I would say that you've built the seats around this model after the fact. So I would probably place in a human in the scene, or figure out the correct heights for a fridge and a table and everything first, just to give a consistent consistency to sizing, as some of the things like this plate is probably larger than what this stool is, and usually plates are a little bit smaller than the seat, but look, I could be wrong a little bit, but also this high chair is going to make people sit at probably eye level to this fridge, so of the top of the fridge. So it's just, I think, for you looking into the proportion of your models like a whole lot more to make sure there's more consistency. But still, in terms of composition too, I feel like you could probably just angle the camera slightly so it's not facing parallel to these lines here, just a bit more to the side, so that we can have a bit more variation in terms of angle. And I think that you can probably crop it a little bit tighter so we don't have as much ceiling and as much floor down the bottom. The floor model does look really nice. I would consider with your reflections possibly adding a HDRI or modeling the other side of this room so there can be some little extra reflections on the lights and other things. And with your lights, using a colored light so that you can have a bit more warmth to the scene rather than it being a pure white light, or it can even be a little bit blue. Consider adding bloom too, so there's a little bit of shine on the highlights that you've got here too. I like the textures that you've put on the wall as well. This texture for wood might be a little bit too large, so consider shrinking it down slightly, but again, this comes down to your proportions, just looking into how big things are compared to one another. And yeah, looking into how you formed some of the UV maps here, just so there's a bit less stretching going on. Overall, it's a really nice render. I would just probably look into those sort of things that I've said that can give a bit more of a complete image, especially with what you're trying to go for. And then from there we can maybe have a look at it again and improve it just that little bit more. Hopefully that helps. Thanks so much for sharing it. Now we've got Rathicus 5569 Sculpt Part 8 Realistic Goku SSJB Work in Progress Texture Text Test Render. Any advice to make the skin look better, more realistic? Okay, so I would look into subsurface scattering if you haven't already. It looks like you've definitely got a different type of material on there. I would actually also look into coloring your lights with a slight yellow and a slight maybe blue as well from a different angle. Looking into trying to show the models a little bit more through that, and I think also making it look a bit more realistic is definitely through subsurface scattering, but also your choice of color, and I would say even actually doing a proper texture painting for it. So there's a thing that you can do with, if you were to paint this person's face, a technique that I use that it can be a really quick way to paint a generally realistic texture is have the whole thing as, like, say, the color of bone, so a light yellowy sort of creamy color, and then you would go through with your texture painting and paint in red where all the blood would be, so say where the cheeks are and maybe the side of the head here, all in the muscles and stuff too, and leave out any areas where it would be the bone and skin, so say right on the cheek, on the brow, and like in the nose I guess a little bit too, stuff like that. And then you would use a fill color, so it'll, like, you know, like the bucket tool in paint, and with a very low opacity, using a skin color, and then when you press fill it will just give a nice layer of skin, and you can still see the bone and the red shine through, which will give a bit more of a realistic variation of where the blood and the bone areas would come through. So it's a bit of a quick way, and it does take a little bit of finesse and a little bit of mucking around to figure out the process and what works best, but that can give some nice variation to your skin. I would also consider possibly adding in little bits of dirt, possibly, and yeah, like looking into the shininess of it and even the reflectivity, like the making it reflective if you haven't already. But hopefully that gives some variation, some indication of where you should look into next, as well as possibly just sharpening up some of this sculpting too to make it look a little bit more realistic, and through that then we'll think more about the realistic skin once it's got that nice sculpt to it. But yeah, hopefully that helps give some direction. And now we've got I Will Smile, my second model I've created, the Silent King from 40k. Thoughts? Alright, let's open it up. So first thing I would actually do is learn how to render correctly, rather than even just a screen cap compared to taking a photo from your phone. And it's and then learning how to light and compose the image, but so far it's really nice. So I would look into having a bit more of a bevel on some of these edges. It is hard to see with this type of render, but adding a bevel will help the light catch on the corners of things a whole lot more, as well as possibly adding in a bit more of more polygons around some of these areas so it can smooth a little bit better, and using shade smoothing just so it smooths out some of those softer areas. I would definitely look into colouring soon, but yeah, adding a bit more of more polygons in here so you can add little bumps and little changes around on these areas here, so it adds a bit more life into the scene. And in time you'll add, I think this is still quite a new process for you, so I would be looking into, like, I'm not going to be too harsh because it's a new process, but adding in little, say, bumps, like little, I'm not sure if they're made out of metal or if they're human, but adding little nuts and bolts or little like boils or warts and stuff on them too can add a lot more variation. And also looking into the thickness of some of your pieces, but I think this is still, like, your process is still a work in progress, so I feel like in time you're just going to get stronger and stronger and everything. But hopefully this gives you some things for you to just focus on for the next few times of your modeling, gives you some direction. Now we've got Canossi, my first animation with Blender. Okay, so nice. So we've got I'm pretty sure, yeah, a little bit of motion blur, which is really nice. We've got a nice animation where it has a bit of weight and easing in. Now, a thing that I think you'll need to look into is this sort of messing around with the light here, where it looks as if like it's clipping out one of the shadows. I'm not sure, but you'll just have to look into that in yourself. But for a first animation, it's really nice. I would probably just consider using two light sources, so one from this angle and then one from this other angle, just to give it a bit more of a rounded look, and using colored lights too, so one may be slightly yellow and one slightly blue will just give a bit more roundness and interesting shadows. Consider also coloring your background slightly too, but that'll change once you've added colored lights in. Yeah, no, that's really good. I think your composition of the animation is really nice too. It's definitely a great start. Awesome work. Now we got Zoja Beats, a scene that I worked on in the past 2 weeks. Need feedback, especially for the house. Okay, let's have a look. So we've just got a minor line down the edge here, so just making sure to crop that out. I'm not sure why that was there. But yeah, just looking into that little thing first. The trees seem to be quite nice. I like your understanding of foreground, midground and background that you've got going on. Maybe just adding a bit more resolution to these rocks, maybe giving them a bit more bump. I feel like they're just a little bit too low resolution for my liking. But it could be that they're in the shadow. And I'll zoom in again onto this. Nice grass and flowers and everything that you've got going on here too. And nice use of depth of field. Good color choices and good trees, like logs that you've got here. And I'm assuming that you're using a HDRI in the background, possibly. This could be an image. I'll just be looking into its resolution, but it could be the render that you've used too. Just because it looks like it's slightly lower resolution, but that's just me. And yeah, I definitely like the way that you've composed this image. You could possibly look into lowering the house in terms of putting up the camera or changing the camera angle slightly, just so it's not as directly in the middle. It could be that maybe it's slightly up or slightly down. I just feel like it's a bit too centered on the horizon, say with this prominent line through the middle. but I do like that it's slightly off center. It's quite balanced in that. But let's just even put it into here when it wants to load. Oh. Just paste as new image. So if I just even crop this off, let's just have a quick look. Yeah, like just cropping it out a little bit more now. I would probably still push those rocks back up there because I feel like it did balance the image down in those bottom corners. But just, it gives it a little bit more breathing room up the top. It makes it a bit tighter down the bottom, which makes it, I think, a bit more balanced compared to that one there, where it's just a bit too open down the bottom here. It's a subtle thing, but yeah, I think that would add to it. Now let's have a look at the actual house model. Alright, so first thing is just sometimes with your wood grain, it seems to curve like and flow a little bit too much, where it doesn't actually fully follow that curve of the wood, but that's okay. Honestly, it's not too bad. It's just something maybe to think about. You do have it consistently pretty good though with the wood, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'd probably just add in some slight variation to these shingles, maybe just having one or like a few here and there just slightly off. It'll just make it a bit more natural, as well as considering how these shingles at the top are connecting underneath probably this beam of wood here. I don't think that they will be going over the top, they'd probably be going underneath. So just looking into maybe doing some research into houses about how that would actually work. And this is pretty nice here too. These are pretty good. I like the vines and stuff that you got there. I would be also considering adding a slight bevel to some of these harsher edges. Just a little bit, just so I can catch the light a little bit more from a different angle. And I'll smooth it out a little bit more. I like the slight variations you do have in this wood slat here, making it look like it's actually been hand built a bit more. Also consider about how you're reusing textures, especially these two right next to each other. And I can also tell that you've repeated this texture here too. It can even just be in post that you just blur one of these out so it doesn't look as prominent. Also think about this area here too, maybe adding in a bolt or something to make it look a bit more connected. It does feel like it was sort of slapped on there. Maybe it looks a bit too new too, so you might want to add a texture of maybe slight rust or making it less reflective. And I think also considering adding in where they would have, how they would have connected these models into the scene by nails, or they might not have used any nails. Also looking into how you've put this texture, where I would say you've had this piece and then duplicated it and stretched it to fit. Excuse me, sorry. I would look into how you should just remake this texture so it's not as stretched and so it fits in with everything else. And I would be adding grass at the connecting point, so where this house hits into the actual grass here, like the long, put in more long grass, because that tends to be where those long grass pieces thrive. And so it can also give a nice nice connecting piece, like it'll make it really link into the grass a whole lot more. And yep, again, just looking into the bevel along these sides, adding in a bit more variation, and how it connects in onto that beam there, as it sort of doesn't really connect well with it there. And I do like this rock stuff in the background. Okay, so yeah, I would consider too, I'm not sure if you've used a colored light for your light source, but using just a bit more color to it possibly, and looking in the direction of your light to really try and show the model more. So because you have the power to position the sun in this case, so you should try and position it to make it the perfect shot, as if someone was to take a photo of this and make it absolutely spot on. I would also possibly consider adding a secondary light coming from a different angle, possibly of a blue light, just to add a bit more depth to this section here. But that's just me, like, it might not work in your scene. And consider adding in bloom to add a bit more shine to these wider areas. And I'm not sure if you have, but also adding in depth of field to maybe blur the stuff in the background if you feel like it's needed. Hopefully that gives you some stuff to look into for your render, just to give you some direction and stuff. Cheers. Now we've got Megatron Sack Tap. Some of my first attempts at sculpting in Blender, having a hard time creating the shape for the hair without deforming the model. Any suggestions? So I would definitely have just a separate model for the hair rather than having it as a connected piece. Kind of just like how you've done it here. I don't know if this is your model, but having it as a separate piece can mean you can push it around a little bit more. And I would say that if we just look at these two, definitely learn how to render as well. Have a proper render. Just putting in like a colored light or two, a slight yellow and a slight blue from different angles, just to fill up the face, can really help just give a bit more of a finished look to your render, to your model, sorry. Now, let me just check. I think that, yeah, you were looking in for 3D printing. Okay, because I was going to mention just the polygon flow, which you sort of have got going on here, but you can just make it more prominent in certain areas. But if you're just going to do this for 3D printing, then that's fine. Now, I'd just be modeling first with a very low resolution. So I'm just going to go back and see, yeah, so again, and the same with the hair too, is having a quite a low resolution first and trying to push those details as far as you can in that lower resolution before you go up to the next level, because then it will keep all the polygons and stuff in a nice position, and keep it quite equal as you're going up the levels, because you can see that these polygons here are quite stretched compared to some of the little areas in here. And so if you keep that resolution as you're building up, then it'll keep a more equal polygon flow, and like everything will be in a better resolution as you're building up. But look into the use of different tools too. Like, you've got a lot of different tools in Blender that can have different effects, so I think just coming down to experience, like, and also using some more references and thinking about the actual internal anatomy of the model that you're putting together, so that you can have a bit more realism in terms of where the bones are and where the meat is, rather than just trying to think purely about what the outside shape is of the face. But it's definitely coming along in terms of, I can see that you've been making some progress in your pieces. I know that it might sound weird because I've only seen one piece, but I can tell that sort of stuff. And I think that definitely just look into rendering and look into using the hair as a separate model and sculpting it like that first. But yeah, hopefully that gives you at least some sort of direction with things that you can look into for your future pieces. It's definitely coming along, and I think you can learn a whole lot more about this and get heaps better. But yeah, cheers. Now I've got Real Fake Viking. Took all day, but I finished my first model. Iron Man Mark II helmet. Any feedback would be appreciated. Alright. First thing I would say is just learning how to render. Just putting in two lights. So we've got a light from the top, maybe a slight yellow, and a light from the bottom, maybe of a slight blue, just to give a bit more depth to the scene. And I would be looking into adding a slight bevel around some of these harsher areas here, just so it can capture the light a little bit more. Also, if you can hear a sound from the background, that's just a bird playing, so just ignore that. I would definitely look into how we've got some sort of lumps around a little bit on here, possibly just smoothing that out and making it a bit more polished. You've definitely got a good understanding of the size and the shape of the model, but yeah, there's still definitely some sort of like streaks from where you've modeled it here, just trying to smooth that all out as much as you can, and adding in little bevels around on these harsher corners here. I think that it's quite a simple model that you've got here, so there's not much I can say about it, but hopefully that gives you just some direction to go in the future with it. Thanks. Now I've got Fusion Knight 2. First time doing a fluid simulation. Feel free to give suggestions. Okay. So first thing I would do is just up the resolution of your render, possibly just so that it's not as grainy. I would also consider adding a bit of color to your light rather than it being so white, and that will just add a little bit more warmth or a bit more effect to the scene. So it could be a yellow, or it could be a blue or a green, but I would sort of just recommend starting with a very light yellow. Composition is quite good. I would even possibly add in a HDRI into the scene to add a little bit more detail to your reflections, as well as possibly changing the background color to something other than grey. But I just feel like it's quite a bland sort of colour. And excuse the bird in the background, please. I would look into your colour choices. Sorry that. I would look into the colour choices of some of your models here too, just to give a bit more interest to the scene. The actual render of the water does look really nice. Maybe you're just looking into adding in some variations of how many droplets there are and some of the settings that you've got going on here too. And also trying to hide this black line that's going on there, as well as even adding in some bloom, adding in some smooth shading onto this area. But thank you, it's a really nice render. Okay, and we've got a blind cookie planning a short film with a CG character, so I did a quick test. Really want to make this look good. How do I improve? Let's open it up. Okay, so I would be looking into adding in a little bit of bloom, possibly into where these light areas are, just to have it a bit more shine. I'm not sure if you've modeled the rest of the scene behind it, but if you haven't, using a HDRI just so it has a bit more of stuff to reflect. I think that upping the resolution of not only the image but possibly the light too can help avoid the sort of grainier looks that we've got going on here. Consider adding depth of field too, to give a bit more of a blur on the background, adding a bit more of a focus on this model. And keep thinking contextually about how this model was built. So this gear would probably be extended a little bit further out. Same with this one, just so it's actually on this sort of strap here. I really like the model, like the texturing and stuff that you've used. Maybe consider as well about what this black area is, but that probably is going to relate to the movie. And also think about the models in the background too. It's hard to know if this is... I feel like this might be a photo. It's hard to know for sure. But considering then also how blurry this door is here compared to how blurry your reflection is. So I would look into, yeah, so this is probably definitely a photo. Looking into the blur of this reflection and how there's some slight yellow variations around the edge of this model. So there's some slight imperfections here. And also excuse the bird in the background there. Looking into composing this image just a little bit more. So I would probably crop it a little bit tighter, just so then we have a bit more focus on the actual model here. Possibly giving it a little bit more breathing room maybe to the side. But it does depend on, because you're having it in a short film, so it really depends on the scenes before and after and everything like that too. Hopefully that gives you some direction to go in with everything here. Oh, and last thing, I would actually look into your camera field of view, like if it's a wide lens or a long lens, and matching that directly with the camera that you're using in Blender, as the stretch and proportions of, say, this top square will be adjusted incorrectly if you've got it wrong, and it won't be able to move correctly around the scene and it'll look very wrong. And so I would say that would be a major thing for this to try and improve. Now we've got Keitheth, Ninja vs Ninja. First animation involving two characters. Pretty happy with the outcome aside from lighting issues. Okay, so we've got some really nice materials on the skin here. I would just brighten up the scene a little bit more. Just a little bit more. I know that it's a dark scene, but you can still use a light blue and stuff like that. Maybe just consider adding a little bit more detail into the actual models so they aren't as boxy. But so far your animation, composition of the characters is quite nice. Maybe also look into having this as a full HD widescreen render. Your choice of lighting is good most of the time. It's just making sure that things are clear. And I like the texture that you've used. You do have some nice simple models. And let's see, looking into motion blur too, so we can blur in some of these areas, adding little sparks when it hits the wall, putting in bloom so there's a bit more of a shine from the lighter areas that you've got going on here, adding depth of field too so that we can have a bit more of a focus on the things closest to us, and using a HDRI too so that we can have a bit more reflections in the areas that need to be reflected, so we can have a bit more interesting reflections. And yeah, I think just in time your models will have a bit more detail. I like the little sparks and stuff that you've got going on here. Now it's just adding the little details, so because I would say that they're a bit too intense. Maybe just lessening the amount of sparks, having them a bit longer and coming from a singular point and making them a bit quicker can add a bit more realism to it too. You've definitely got some good stuff going on. Hopefully what I've said gives you a bit more direction and stuff to focus on with everything that you're going here, everything that's going on here. Right, now we've got Vax the Maxed, Low Poly Grizzly Bear version 1. Incomplete, needs ears and tail. Feedback welcome. Alright, let's open it up. So the first thing I'm going to do is just, I'm going to put it into GIMP and I'm going to give it a bit more contrast, just so it's a bit more obvious. What I would consider is how you've got this section here. I'll be breaking that into squares similar to the rest of the model, just so we have some more consistency. Just excuse the bird in the background, just going a bit nuts. I would also use a coloured light to have a bit more warmth into the scene rather than a white light, but still I know that this is just a work in progress render, but I still think you should practice good composition and good lighting with that. And talking about composition, I would probably just cut off a little bit more from this section, just so now it's a little bit tighter around this model, maybe even taking off a little bit more from the bottom there too. And I think adding a bit more variation into the legs to give it a bit more weight and thickness, as it's quite boxy around here. Like you've done on the front leg, you've just given it a bit more of a tapering look. I still think you should add that into the back leg there too. But it's definitely, it's a good model. Maybe just pushing this sharp area here back a little bit more, giving a bit more form to the neck and the head. But so far that's a really nice model. Alright, now we've got the next one here. This is my first serious render. I was hoping to get some feedback on it. Okay, so first I'm just going to copy it into here, because I feel like you can just slightly adjust the brightness a little bit more, making it look a little bit cleaner, and you could probably crop it a little bit tighter so that the focus is a little bit more on the watch rather than the wood. And I would crop it maybe just a little bit tighter so it's slightly off center. But it's something that I think you need to think about. See, I feel like this could be cropped a little bit more. So I would look into photography for watches, look into how people take photos of watches and what they look into. And I do like the textures that you've used. I would even look into some minor ambient occlusion so that there's a bit more of a shadow around where the thread is going on here. And looking into these sort of flaws here of where it's maybe been minor stretched, where of how you've maybe formed the UV map. And I would also incorporate a HDRI so that there's some more reflections coming from the top of the scene rather than just around the edges here. Your actual model is quite nice. Also consider going all the way around here. It's just little things like that, making sure that the model actually goes all the way around so you can model it quite completely. But everything's quite nice in this. I would even consider maybe a minor use of depth of field, using bloom to make this shine a little bit more, and using a slightly colored light of maybe a very light yellow to give it a bit more warmth and a bit more realism in terms of lighting. But nice work. Okay, now we've got Morph Studio HD. We've got Fear, current work in progress. Let's open it up and have a look. Okay, cool. So we've got a sort of moving model. I would look into, first off, your field of view, just so that you might be able to get a bit more of a popping outlook. So if it was in either like a wider or a longer lens, exploring how they affect the model and the variations in depth that you can have. I like the use of bloom. I would consider maybe adding a little bit more color to this top light, just so it's not pure white. But that's just me. It does look like a really nice looking model. Maybe in terms of composition, I would probably give a little bit more room to the sides, or maybe cropping it just a little bit smaller, so cropping off this top bit here. Adding in a vignette can make it a bit nicer and closer into this center model, and looking into adding a bit more resolution to, say, this bottom section here, so it can round a little bit more and you have a little bit more control of its shape and its smoothness. Even possibly adding in a bevel into all these harsh areas here too. Alright, our second last one, and we've got Clampart 3D, Tylosaurus in open ocean. Been working on this for a while. Any critiques, welcome. So what I'm going to do is just copy this and put it into GIMP here, and I'm just going to slightly adjust the curves. Yeah, just like that. So just to show I just wanted to lighten up the darker areas a little bit more, because then we can see the model a little bit more. And I would probably use a bit more of, so I would use a light from the top with a slight color of maybe a yellow, and then a color from the bottom of probably like a dark blue, just to give a bit more variation to the scene. Also looking into the coloring too, of just maybe it being slightly greener. I would add some, with composing this image, I would probably move some of these fish out a little bit more, and thinking about how you position the camera. So you could probably even crop the shot a bit tighter, and looking into adding possibly some light rays coming through the top of the ocean, like the top of it there, as well as upping the resolution for both probably the image and the lighting, so it smooths out, doesn't look so grainy. And consider also using depth of field, so we can get a bit more of a variation and a bit of a better indication of size. Also consider stuff off in the distance, as it should like get darker the further away it is in the ocean, and this can really help show a more interesting silhouette of the model here too. Consider also the use of bloom and adding a HDRI for reflections in the background. Okay, then we've got Mr. Awesome Reddit. I made this quick rubber bouncy ball physics simulation. Did I do the texture right? I'm a beginner. So it depends on how this wood's made if we look at the textures, but I would say that in a way it's sort of incorrect because it's flowing around as if the wood has bent around this way. And so I would try and think of these pieces as completely separate bits of wood and giving them a bit more variation on the connecting points, so that you can think of them as each separate plank of wood. But also consider using a normal map too. Sorry for all the noise as well, it's just how it is. I would consider adding a normal map too, just to give some variation to bumps, and throwing in a HDRI map in the background, but probably adding a black background in the render, just so that we can have the HDRI to get a bit more variation to reflections. And now we've got some really nice textures on the balls too. I'd be really happy with those. They're looking really nice. Consider also the use of motion blur and bloom to capture some shinier light sections. But in terms of your actual simulation, it's really nice. I'd probably just give a bit more room as well down the bottom and top of the box, so it has a bit more breathing room around, and we can focus on the box just that little bit more rather than the camera being so close up. But no, nice. Alright, and that's it for everybody. Hopefully that helped some people. Hope it wasn't too noisy with everything. But I will catch you next time.